All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today, SAP Self-Audit Season. Are you ready? Just a couple housekeeping items. Presentation is going to be around 30 to 40 minutes, so we do have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put that into the chat box and we will get to your questions towards the end of the presentation, just to not disrupt the flow of the presentation. Furthermore, our speakers today, Sebastian Schulz, he's the Executive Director of voquz IT Solution. Sebastian opened the first US-based office in New York City in 2015. His expertise is helping companies optimize their SAP license inventory and discover cases of indirect usage. A little bit about voquz. The voquz Group is a solution provider and system integrator for IT environments. The software samQ is voquz's flagship product for SAP license management. Lorenzo Squilati, he is from S&P. His experience is working with the SAP ecosystem for over 20 years. He's going to be leveraging his industry experience and technical background in this webinar. A little bit about S&P. Our core business and software solution is S&P Transformation Backbone. It's a standardized software that automatically analyzes and implements changes in IT systems, enables companies to grow through mergers and acquisitions, divesting, carving out of business units. S&P Applications Division includes data provision and masking, interface scanner, and Dragamon translation solution. These are all important tools to ensure system security and prepare for transformation events. All right. Just go over the agenda today. We're going to start with the SAP License System Measurement 101. I'm going to dive into the obstacles and common mistakes, how indirect access ties into the annual self-audit, how to avoid unfriendly on-site audits, and tips and guidelines for your SAP self-audit. Before I get started, I'm just going to ask a question today just to gauge where we are at to better craft and answer everyone's questions for today's webinar. So I'll just give you a couple moments to answer the question that is on the screen. And as we are waiting for the results to come in, just wanted to again say thank you for attending today's webinar. We do have a promotional offering towards at the end of the presentation. S&P is going to be offering our interface scanner and samQ by voquz, a complimentary license pre-audit assessment. Just give it a couple more seconds here. Excellent. See, all the polls are in. And I will just be passing this on to Sebastian first. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Miranda. I hope you guys can all see the results of the poll. So we have a pretty significant 82% of attendees with concerns about indirect access, and it's still a hot topic. I think most of you have heard about the court rulings earlier this year that kind of put the whole topic on a lot of people's map. And we're going to talk today about the intersection of what indirect access means, specifically in the context of the annual self-audit. So without further ado, good morning, everybody. Happy SAP audit season. We're going to talk about the most important things to know about the self-audit process, and I'm going to be calling out specific opportunities to avoid unnecessary spending on the compliance or the licensing side. So starting with a quick 101 introduction, I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with the standard process of how the annual self-audit results are submitted to SAP. Typically takes about 4 to 6 weeks of work. Nobody likes really doing it because it distracts from the actual workload that you have. And I want to call out a couple important things as you might be preparing for this year's self-audit. So obviously, one of the things about the process is that SAP provides the transactions, namely USMM and LAW, to do the measurement and to submit those numbers. And if you take a look at the help pages, it becomes pretty evident that SAP is merely offering you access to these tools to do a tally up. So the idea is SAP wants to keep track of how much more license inventory you might need to buy for the next true-up. And it's not really meant to help you either optimize license use or even help you invest in more affordable license types. So the question that really begs is, how do we handle the group of users that might currently be licensed to perform a lot of tasks, but who are really only using limited functionality for their job? And you can think of maybe, let's say, 100 people in the finance department currently have a professional license. Maybe they're just running a couple of reports and could be okay with an employee license, which is significantly cheaper than the professional. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is one of the issues that we see with the way that the audit is typically performed. And another good thing to keep in mind is that the SAP guidelines will actually tell you that the user should be classified based on the current use every time you do the system measurement. Obviously, if you went in and you validated if the license that has been assigned months, years ago to your users, if that's still the most appropriate, you're probably going to have to hire additional people, because that's really a Herculean task to check all of these assignments. But as you'll see, there's actually some neat ways to do this in a way to help you save money. So now that we've got this out of the way, obviously the self-audit is really driven by how you classify your users. That's where all of this starts. USMM and LAW will merely read what you have already classified on your system, and this is also the data that's being submitted to SAP eventually. A lot of long-time SAP customers might have primarily professional, limited professional licenses. Obviously today, there's relatively new licenses like the worker, logistics, that could be much, much more cost-effective purchases for you. And so it's interesting to just keep tabs on what's actually happening in the SAP world, and also, consider if you might be able to classify certain users based on these more recent license types. So here's some, rather inconvenient facts that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. So the standard tools that SAP provides, namely role-based licensing, that's usually based on authorizations, access, and that kind of line of thinking, USMM, SLAW, multi-client licensing across multiple systems. None of these processes were really designed to help you ensure a correct license assignment. And when I say correct, I mean a compliant way of doing it, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not overspending on licenses. And so anytime there's uncertainty or a lack of knowledge, we see typically about 40% overspending over the lifetime of an SAP account into licenses that might not always have been required. So what we want to preach is an active license management approach, and we'll show you how you can actually implement some of that philosophy as you make the license management process a more, monthly or at least semi-annual process. So biggest takeaway for you today is, how you can actively prevent unfriendly audits by SAP, and at the same time optimizing the usage of the licenses for maximum cost efficiency. So going over some of the known obstacles and some of the less known obstacles, we're going to start with one of the main issues that I see, which is insufficient preparation. And so what does that typically look like? I usually find that a lack of unified understanding between the different departments at a company can often create this gap of knowledge, and that's kind of amplified by the fact that the license manager oftentimes is not an SAP power user. So blindly trusting the results of the USMM protocol, that's something you should avoid. You should always double check the results, and I have some examples later that show why these results can sometimes be really off, giving SAP a bit of an upper hand. But at the same time, the SAP basis and security teams often might not know the exact SAP license portfolio that's owned and the contractual definitions. At the same time, we always want to consider and encourage you to move away from licensing that's tight on authorizations And keeping in mind this guideline from SAP that if you base it on usage, you can typically bring down the overall license consumption significantly. So, these are some of the kind of high-value things that fall into insufficient preparation that we should really spend some time talking about today. At the same time, we did the poll about indirect access, and I want to spend maybe 30 seconds to a minute explaining how the indirect access topic ties into the self-audit. So obviously, if there's questions later during the Q&A, we can speak more about what indirect access means and how it's governed. But in general, indirect access happens when you're using SAP processing power coming in through outside non-SAP applications or interfaces. The issue is that it's really hard to quantify. SAP has not been defining this fairly accurately in the material or your contract, and there really is no one best way to license indirect access as a customer. SAP will always try to do custom agreements, and even the new volume-based metrics that have been announced during Sapphire in May this year, they're merely a suggestion. So before you make any rash decisions, always do the math whether adopting a order-based metric actually benefits you. Existing customers can always buy more of what they already own. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. If you want to understand indirect access, it's typically hard for customers to do. But in projects, we typically focus on the actual data that's flowing through all of the interfaces. So getting an idea of everything that's coming through a portal, PI, XML, iDocs, RFC, all these means can essentially be used to create interface connections to outside systems. So it requires some expertise and tools to really get to the bottom of it. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Lorenzo in just a second, but in summary, the issue around indirect access I see is that it really is a black box. It's not well defined, there's still no price list, and as a customer, it's often difficult to estimate what your exposure is. And on the flip side, I've seen the SAP account executives often overstating what the potential exposure actually is to create some pressure. So you're always better off coming up with your own objective measurements rather than having SAP scare you into believing that there's a lot of financial exposure. You might have heard about Anheuser-Busch in the US, $600 million indirect access lawsuit. Diageo in the UK, which Lorenzo will talk about a little bit more, also multi-million-dollar claim. One thing from the indirect access and self-audit perspective, I've seen in the last 18 months that SAP likes to follow up with what I call a indirect access questionnaire that's essentially a request for more information after you submit your annual self-audit LAW report. This is an initial piece of evidence that they might be looking into your indirect access infrastructure a little bit more closely. And when that happens, try to keep information as close to your chest as possible before you disclose anything to SAP. So, two important points to remember. We see in the reality of things that every SAP customer is typically over-licensed without knowing it by a quite dramatic 40%. So we can repurpose some of that existing inventory to reduce the exposure for indirect access. At the same time, the account representative will likely try to overstate exposure without really showing you any hard evidence. And these are two facts that we can really leverage to create certainty and have an advantage for you rather than for the SAP account team. So before I hand it over to Lorenzo, here's a quick poll that aims at your knowledge of interfaces. Obviously, these interfaces are often the crux of potential indirect access lawsuits. So if you would indulge me real quick and respond to this poll right now, then Lorenzo will have a great foundation to kind of kick off his part of the presentation and address how indirect access and interfaces tie into all of this interesting topic that we're talking about today. So Lorenzo, I see the majority of people are responding. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thanks everybody for responding to this poll, and I'll leave you with the results right here, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you very much. And good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. As you can see, there's a kind of a mixed bag, basically 30% across the board in terms of having a good handle on all your interfaces and some knowing some, but not all of it, and some portion that basically have no clue. And as Sebastian conveyed, these interfaces really are a direct correlation to the risk exposure you perhaps might have in terms of addressing indirect access. So what I want to talk about today is in terms of the SAP interface environment is really, how do you assess what your risk might be opposite the Diageo ruling that Sebastian conveyed, and really talk about how getting a better handle on your interfaces can really help you from an overall system security perspective and compliance, as well as help you optimize your entire landscape for your interfaces. And typically when we're talking to clients, when we talk to them, most folks, kind of opposite what we see, most folks don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they have, and they're really at a loss. It really is an issue when they're doing some type of transformation project, whether they're doing a merger or divestiture, or they're looking at doing a migration to the cloud. And those are the real key issues that really can basically spell disaster with those types of transformation efforts. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what we find basically is, as I just mentioned, that most folks don't have an accurate view of their interface environment, and really the reason for that is a combination of reasons. Number one, they don't have the data, they don't have current tools, and it's often a very, very manual process. And hence, some folks may have some kind of knowledge based upon an inherent knowledge of the environment, or they're a functional user, and they know that their business process utilizes this interface, but it's, if it's not documented and centralized for all to see as you go through various transformation projects, or if you're trying to get a handle on your indirect access compliance, there really could be an exposure there. Next slide. So, basically after the recent Diageo ruling, where they basically had to pay SAP $54 million or pounds because of indirect access, you really want to take a look at this in terms of the risk exposure that your companies have. And really, the interface access is basically where they key on in terms of the indirect access exposure. And really, any exposure by obtaining an accurate view of your interface landscape is going to really help position you to better negotiate and interact with your SAP account team. Next slide, please. So the second goal in terms of getting a handle on your interface is really more from a security and compliance perspective. You really understand yourself. Do you have unused interfaces out there that are leaving loopholes or exposures into your system? Do you have access to key systems like HR systems, and who's really using those interfaces for exchanging HR data back and forth? Are you adhering to proper protocols, whether it be RFCs or IDOCs? And really, if you have a bunch of interfaces out there that are still there in the system but not being used, they really are consuming overhead and resources of the environment, as well as creating this security exposure. So finding those out and removing them is benefited twofold. Number one, you obviously remove the security exposure, but also you reduce the overhead burden. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk to a lot of folks about this topic, they really don't know what they don't know. So it's really impossible to lock your doors if you really don't know where the doors are and how many you have. So the last goal for really wanting to get a handle on your SAP interface landscape is for facilitating change, some kind of transformation, whether you're doing a project, if you are utilizing monitoring applications within your environment. Those monitoring applications need to be aware of those interfaces in order to properly monitor them. So that's one thing. If you're looking at doing a carve-out, divestiture, or some type of upgrade or a migration to the cloud, all of these projects or all of these transformation opportunities really necessitate the need for having a good handle on the interfaces to ensure the success of the project or transformation. Next slide, please. So Sebastian, back to you in terms of some key tips and tricks in terms of how do you position yourself for a successful audit.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. Let's get right into it. I'm keeping an eye on the questions, by the way. There's already one very interesting one that came in asking about something I said earlier, which is how to use some of the existing inventory to actually defend against indirect access exposure. And I want to speak about that during the Q&A. So I'd like to implore you, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Miranda will take care of them. And we're going to try and keep this overall presentation at a minimum so that we can spend most of our time toward the end taking questions. So let's get right into it. What does the actual self-audit look like, and how can we avoid some of the common mistakes? And one of them is making sure that you don't unintentionally recommend to SAP that they should come take a closer look and do an unfriendly audit. So quick definition, unfriendly audit is when SAP actually comes on site and does digging and really looks into everything. So in contrast to the self-audit, which is something that you actually control. So a few things that we see that can actually trigger an unfriendly audit, starting with a lot of sudden changes before the self-measurement. So we see it's just a reality that a lot of SAP customers, they kind of dread this whole self-audit process because it takes a lot of time. And then, maybe a couple of weeks before the results are due, they realize there's a lot of cleanup that needs to get done, and they doctor with the system, and they make a lot of changes and clean everything up. And SAP at this point is actually able, if they want to collect the past 3 months of usage history, so that they can do some more detailed analysis of what's happening on your landscape. And this is something that we typically recommend avoiding by making slight adjustments throughout the year, doing some right sizing, meaning we're gonna move high value licenses that people occupy today and validate if they actually need it, or if we can give them a cheaper license, and doing that throughout the year rather than doing this mass cleanup right before the actual audit is due. The other big topic is no growth. So if you haven't really spent any money with SAP in the past 12 to 18 months, and that can be new license purchases, or maybe you have recently decided against an SAP solution in favor of a competitive product, be it Workday versus SuccessFactors, or a custom e-commerce solution versus Hybris. These are all things where SAP is getting a little bit anxious, and they might bring up this topic of indirect access or on-site audits to alleviate the pressure on their end because their revenue is declining. I don't agree with the practice, but again, it's something that we have noticed in the past. And so the best defense strategy you can have against this is running your own compliance sanity checks to avoid any surprises if the day comes that SAP actually does want to take a closer look. And obviously, the two things that we want to look at is, are you under licensed in any area? And this could be engines, it could be named user licenses, but obviously also indirect access. Lorenzo talked about this a little bit. Are we aware of all of the different vectors that might put you at risk for exposure? So two important topics to get a handle off proactively rather than have SAP sort of bring this up with you, and then you're put in a position where you have to act reactively. One pretty easy topic is making sure that before the audit, you don't have any developer keys that are actually unneeded. Besides the business expert user that we often see in association with a BW system, the developer licenses are the most expensive category. So this is a low-hanging fruit, really, to make part of your due diligence to ensure that there's no keys that have been created and are actually no used. There's this really interesting thing with SAP licensing in general where SAP will never stop you to provision additional license keys or developer accounts. At the end of the day, you're just going to get an invoice after the next self-audit there's no mechanisms built into SAP to stop you from provisioning users or assigning something that's not needed. And a quick example of that is if you were today going to just reclassify every single person as a professional, SAP would not tell you that there's an issue. They would just probably send you an invoice for a true-up. So it's really up to you to keep track of these things. And again, the idea today is calling out some of these things so that you can incorporate that into your standard process for the self-audit. So fairly easy to check the validity for developer accounts and all of the systems, and then you can go ahead and remove some of those unused keys from the SAP marketplace. I think this one is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. I think the negotiation errors that we often see, they can be a little bit more costly if not addressed. So one example is if you were to purchase new licenses after the self-measurement, that really puts you at a bit of a disadvantage, because if SAP is the one to see, hey, you're under licensed here, you need to buy a couple more engines there, oftentimes you will lose a company-specific discount for these new purchases, which obviously if you're buying list price, that can be a big difference in terms of price. And you're really putting yourself in a fairly weak position to negotiate with SAP, right? Besides that, it's typically also hard when there's time pressure to actually confirm whether the results of the self-audit are legitimate and if you really have a business need for some of those purchases that SAP is telling you that you need to make. So a better approach is forecasting new license demand way ahead of the annual self-measurement. Also, buying licenses earlier in the year typically will give you a bit more leverage, because the SAP account executive team, it's early in the year, they have a lot of time to hit their sales goals, and unfortunately a lot of indirect access is actually driven by whether the account executive team on SAP sites has met the annual ratio or quota. So having that knowledge and being in the driving seat is definitely an advantage for you. And you kind of see this recurring theme of active license management. That's really something that we try to preach, and obviously there's permanent to-dos that need to be taken care of throughout the year. We want to make sure that we're giving out the most affordable license types and we're not overspending on, let's say, professional licenses, keeping inactive users at bay. There's a few things that we really want to keep track of, and indirect access definitely falls into that same category. So the last point that I want to make here is make sure you double check the LAW results. You need to have sort of a single source of truth, and oftentimes when LAW consolidates your USMM protocols, there's issues that can occur. And one of the common things that we actually see happening for clients is that a not well-known background table called LAW-CONT sometimes doesn't have the accurate licensing structure. And you can think of this as a master definition of what rolls into which license. And obviously, a professional license is supposed to contain any lower level license below it. So employee, ESS, that all rolls up into a professional licenses. And if this table doesn't match your licensing structure, it can really cause issues, and you might end up paying double for certain accounts that have not been properly consolidated by LAW. So another interesting area to just make sure you're aware of this issue that we see about 40 to 50% happening for the self-audit. So it's quite common. Miranda at the very beginning mentioned that we're in the SAP licensing space and have our own add-on. So an easy way to actually compare and check the LAW results is to just have a comparison of what the expected results are and how LAW has come up with the consolidation. So definitely spend some time double checking the results before you just submit it to SAP. I want to go over a quick overview of how SAP is really in a beneficial position when it comes to collecting some additional license revenue from its customers. So user classifications really drive the license spending, as we said earlier. And doing that is a little bit unfeasible without a proper support system in place. Obviously, indirect access, that's a whole other area that can create financial exposure if you don't address it proactively. And then also, you know, SAP audits are more and more based on transactional history. So the approach that we take with helping someone reduce their license spending is to right-size the entire license landscape by moving away from authorizations and really adopting a usage-based classification system. So if you remember that example I gave earlier, people in a finance department that are just running some display reports, transactions, they obviously don't always need a professional license. And so that's really the delta that you should tap into before you submit any self-audit results, so that you don't end up buying more licenses that are not really needed. And the whole idea that I want you to kind of familiarize yourself with is looking at what you own versus what is deployed versus what is actually needed. And this part in bold is typically in the information that is hard to get at because it's not built into LAW or USMN. So, you know, I want to get to the Q&A part fairly quickly. So the only thing I'm calling out on this slide is that on average, there is potential to actually reduce the license spending by about 40%. Hard to realize typically unless you spend a lot of time or employ a tool. But keep in mind that once you have gone in and maybe freed up some of those high-value licenses, that gives you the possibility to potentially defend yourself against any claims from SAP for indirect access. And this also shows you why you know, maybe keeping this named user-based licensing schema for indirect access could really benefit you, because if it turns out you're already over-licensed and you can just repurpose some of that what you own for indirect access, that might be the better scenario for you rather than adopting the volume-based metrics. So here's a quick idea of how you know, our tool gives you an idea of what's the license timeline, how can we do the user classification based on actual usage, bringing down the license consumption overall to a low-cost state, and really keeping track of a lot of these compliance-relevant metrics like engines, indirect access, and doing it in a centralized fashion. So I want to hand it over back to Lorenzo, and we can talk about these specific things during the Q&A part. So Lorenzo, if you want to take it over, I'll hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so very much. So yeah, the compliance really does, as Sebastian conveyed, it does take a lot of time and effort and cost and manpower. And having an automated application to facilitate that process really does help. And I think the samQ product that Sebastian and team offer is a great asset to anyone who really wants to proactively manage their SAP audit experience. But as we also conveyed, the issue about identifying indirect access is a big issue. So SNP offers an application called its Interface Scanner. And this application will go out automatically and document, it will identify and document and visually display all the interfaces into and out of your SAP system. Once it does that, it will actually create Visio schematics of that environment. And really the value of having an application like this really reduces the cost of you doing this manually by over 90%. And the challenge with keeping track of your interfaces manually is that as soon as you document it, it's most likely going to be outdated. So the SNP Interface Scanner gives you the ability to initially scan, identify, and document, but to manage that and keep it centralized in a centralized repository to manage those interfaces over time. Next slide, please. So we will go through our application. Basically, will utilize all of the most common. I won't read them off to you, but as you probably are aware, all of the various interface protocols associated with doing interfaces with it within SAP. Next slide. And then really what we do is we document them into a report, but we also will create a Visio schematic where you can visually see the interfaces into and out of your SAP environment, as well as how many times you're being called. And you can take this information and export it to either Excel or to a PDF. But this gives you really objective information and will help you identify potential avenues for indirect access exposure. Next slide. So I think this is kind of wraps up our end of the webinar. I'll turn it back over to Sebastian and Miranda.
Yeah, Miranda, I guess you can take us to the Q&A next. I wanted to quickly talk about the offering as a thank you to attendees today. You know, SNP is offering their interface scanner if you want to get a good idea and a quick glimpse of the interfaces that have been deployed over time. This is a good starting point to maybe get some initial metrics on your interface environment and potential exposure for indirect access that goes with it. For samQ, our asset management tool for SAP, we're actually offering a complimentary license pre-audit assessment. So kind of going with the audit season, a lot of people are getting ready right now to submit. And we're interested in showing you some areas where you can actually reduce license spending. And like I said, this really ties into a potential defense strategy for indirect access. You know, the way to qualify for the promotional offering, go ahead and reach out, shoot us a message. We'll put up this email address again in a second, and we'll be in touch. So I want to move over to the Q&A part now. There's a couple questions that came in, and Miranda, maybe you can just moderate this segment, and you know, attendees, if you want to keep submitting questions, we'd appreciate it. If you're okay with this, Miranda, I'd like to start with that one question that I saw earlier, which is this whole idea of how do you tap into existing inventory to maybe help reduce the financial exposure. And you know, that kind of goes with another question that I saw in which someone asked, the SAP claim against Diageo, you know, obviously that was for about $70 million, and the court had some comments that the professional licenses were not really correctly assigned, and the person asking this question just made a comment that it's probably going to be settled for a lot less than the initial exposure. And I fully agree with you here. And the issue that I see mostly for SAP customers is that there's a tendency for the big vendors like SAP or Oracle to come in and overstate that initial exposure by a factor of, let's say, 10 times, right? So when we're going in and we're doing an objective measurement, oftentimes it turns out that the real exposure might be around, let's say, 500,000, but SAP's strategy is usually to go in and say, hey, you know, we might be talking about 10 million here. What do we want to do, right? And then you enter arbitration. There's a lot of back and forth. But as a customer, you're typically hard-pressed to produce valuable data. And so in the Diageo case, yeah, they asked for $70 million, and they might settle it for, let's say, 15. But what if the real exposure, if you did your own measurement, was 1 million, right? Then you're still severely overpaying. And so I think that this initial exposure that's set high, the strategy really is to come in with the highest request possible and then be like buddy-buddy and try to settle it at a lower amount. But what I really want to, you know, the message I want to share with you is, if you're going in and you're looking at what you own today, and maybe you're able to reclassify a significant amount of users into more affordable license classes based on how they're actually using SAP, that's a fantastic way to free up high-value licenses like a professional or a limited professional, and that then gives you options to use those licenses for any indirect access scenarios. And you know, I can talk about this some more, but hopefully that addresses both of these questions in one go. And Miranda, if you want to maybe run us through the next questions and see if there's also a couple for Lorenzo.
Absolutely. I think a follow-up question to that is, how do you see it? Should an internal audit be on a quarterly basis? Will that be sufficient?
I think that's probably a good timeline to shoot for. Obviously, when we're looking into auditing, compliance, and licensing, if you invest in an asset management tool, the idea is to have this running continuously in the background, right? So if you can automate the user classification process in such a fashion that you're always compliant, but you're also ensuring that you're keeping license spending at bay, I think that's really the best way to kind of tackle this problem. But if you wanted to pick a period, I would say doing it on a quarterly basis is probably much, much better than doing it annually. Also, when it comes to expiring users, looking at current use, a quarter is typically what SAP will also look at during these audits. So that's the period that oftentimes is important for the compliance.
Excellent, thank you. This is a question on tooling. How about the manual tool SLAW and USMM? Its process is a pain. How would you rate Snow, Flexera, Asset Studio, or alike tools to that?
Yeah, I mean, you've named a couple players in that space. Obviously, we operate in the same space, and if you look at some of the Gartner articles on tooling, it's usually samQ by voquz, that's us, Flexera and Snow. These are definitely the common tools. There's pros and cons to all of these, but I think the common takeaway is that don't rely on SLAW and USMM, because those are not software asset management tools. It's as easy as that. These two processes are built by SAP, and they don't help the customer manage the licenses effectively. So that's really my takeaway. That's also why with our tool we do the complementary assessment for as the promotion today, to kind of show some early areas very quickly without doing a lot of digging and work to find potential to actually optimize the license classifications. I hope that helps.
Excellent, thank you. This is a question for Lorenzo. What are some of the common reports your interface scanner application produces?
Sure, that's a great question. So some of the reports are, number one, all of the unused interfaces, which is obviously from a security perspective very, very important. What are the top 50 interfaces that you guys use, so you can kind of see where if you have resource issues or challenges, and then also you can do reports by interface type, whether it be IDOC, whether it be RFC, or database connection. So there's a variety of reports built into the application that really allow the quick reporting and viewing. But again, the integration into a Visio application that allows you to visualize or visually see the interfaces and how they flow into and out of your environment, I think is even more valuable.
Excellent, thank you. I believe this question is for you as well, Lorenzo.
Okay.
Does your interface scanner application run with SAP PI and PO or any other third-party middleware platforms?
It does, as a matter of fact. So PI and PO is obviously what many folks use as their middleware piece for consolidating interfaces for their SAP environment. But there are also third-party products like Oracle WebLogic. Our application will work with both of those types of, whether it be a third-party middleware product or with the SAP PI/PO middleware piece in order to help you track interfaces through those middleware platforms.
Excellent. Another question, reporting usage over SAP NetWeaver MDM products, is it possible?
I'm not sure if that's for Lorenzo or me specifically. I'd say this is an interesting topic, and whoever asked that, if you want to reach out to me, we can definitely take that offline. It works a little bit differently, but let's discuss. And if you can give me a bit more context, I'm happy to share expertise around NetWeaver MDM specifically.
Excellent. Looks like our last question is, can you just speak a little more about the promotional assessment? I believe that's for Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we go back to the same slide real quick, and depending on who the question is for, I mean, I can speak a little bit more about the license pre-audit assessment. The idea really is to spend, a couple hours, this is fairly straightforward, looking at the current license assignments, how you've been doing it up to this point in time, and then, giving you an insight into what's deployed, but more importantly, what's actually needed. So reducing the overall license consumption away from the high-value licenses toward the more affordable ones, even if you don't own certain license types today. Worker, logistics, employee, these all come to mind. So results are typically fairly interesting if in the past you've been largely licensing based on authorizations rather than current use. So I can say that about the assessment. Obviously, if you're interested to learn more, go ahead and reach out and we can chat. Lorenzo, if you want to say another word about the interface scanner, I'll hand it back to you.
And
Sure.
actually, Sebastian, just to play off of that, is the assessment done remotely, and how much effort is required on your assessment, just before we get to?
Yes, sure. That's a great question. Thanks for asking. It is done fully remotely, and it's also not intrusive. So we're talking about typically 3 to 5 hours usually, and even that's a pretty conservative estimate, in which we can pull the data, generate the report, and reflect everything back to you. So done remotely, and doesn't require a lot of time from your team, and we actually leverage our own tool, samQ, which is written in ABAP. So all of it is standard SAP fare, and can be handled by the internal basis team that you already have. Hope that helps.
I believe another question just popped up. What other SAP license metrics can you measure apart from the user license metric?
That's another good question. I mean, obviously, when it comes to reducing spending and optimizing the right license usage, the named user-based metric just has the most potential because there's so much variability in the license types that you can purchase. The other thing that factors into compliance is engine consumption, concurrent users on something like a BobJ system. These are a little bit different, though, because of the fact that, if you have an engine that's based on company revenue, I can cut your revenue in half, and I doubt that you would want me to do that if I could. So some of these metrics you can report on and you can forecast in order to make more intelligent purchase decisions. But I think the meat of all of this, the real potential, lies in the named user-based licenses, and that's why we focus the audit assessment on that. But obviously, we can report on many, many more license metrics.
Excellent. We did have another question come through. How does one discuss with SAP the differences between samQ and LAW reports? I believe that's on slide 34 if we wanted to jump back to that.
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. So I think a lot of talking to SAP, discussing, negotiating, the issue often is just having useful data at hand that you can actually show and explain what your logic is, right? And so essentially, this is why we built a module that not only shows you the samQ data, that would also be the underlying source when you're running USMM and LAW, but we want to see if there's any differences between the two consolidations. The approach we've taken with samQ is that you're still submitting the results using USMM and LAW, so we're not replacing that. However, because samQ can manage the license assignments, USMM will simply read out what's already on your systems. And so if it turns out that there's a difference, first of all, you can drill down on what users are actually affected by this delta. And in my experience, oftentimes it turns out that maybe the latest SAP note hasn't been applied, causing a different result in the output, right? So it really starts with being aware that you have a delta, and then very easily running through a checklist to find out what the causes of that issue. The other thing to keep in mind, I had mentioned this table here, right? So that's another common issue that you can quickly just kind of check if it's accurate. But you need to have this data first. If you're not checking the LAW report, then all of this might just pass you by without you ever noticing it. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Looks like that is it for the questions that are coming in.
I think we got some really great questions. Thank you everybody for asking, and I'm just going to leave you, I guess, with the results of that initial poll. 82% of you are still, at least looking into indirect access, maybe trying to figure out what it means for you. And hopefully one of the themes today that you're walking away with is that you might already be sitting on some existing inventory that if you only start using it more effectively, you can at the same time reduce your exposure on indirect access. And if that's something that might be relevant for you because you're worried that there's some money on the line, definitely feel free to chat with me or Lorenzo. Always happy to kind of discuss some easy steps that can be taken to get you moving in the right direction. But I'm going to hand it over back to you, Miranda, to close us out. But again, I'd like to thank everybody for the great questions that you've asked today.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending our webinar. In the handouts, you will see in the handout section on the GoToWebinar, you will see the PowerPoint that we have done today. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate in reaching out. That USA, there's both of Lorenzo and Sebastian's email addresses. You can also reach out to USA at voquz.com. Again, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to the next webinar.